Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Public Affairs Association of Canada's Ontario chapter, I would like to welcome everyone to our pre-Ontario, our Ontario election panel this afternoon. My name is Allan Gregg, and I'm the president of the Public Affairs Association of Canada's Ontario chapter. This is an exciting event considering that we are partnering today with Earnscliffe Strategies, and there is no shortage of issues to talk about as it relates to the Ontario election. With the Ontario provincial election coming up quickly, there is a lot of key trends and a lot of polling analysis that has been done. And so today, our expert panel is going to be exploring that, as well as what this means for the public affairs industry, the election day on June 2nd, but also to explore how the electorate is viewing each of these different issues. So from the economy, cost of living, affordable housing, to name a few examples. And so the panel is you're gonna be able to hear from our panel on how the policy positions of each party are addressing priorities for Ontarians across the province. A few housekeeping items. If you are not speaking, I would ask that you please place yourself on mute to avoid any background noise or any distractions during the webinar. We are on social media, so please join the conversation on Twitter at our Twitter handle PAAC84 and using the hashtag PAACON. That's PAACON. I would also like to thank in advance Earnscliffe Strategies for their sponsorship. Lois Marsh, our managing director, for assisting with the logistics and the administration of the event, as well as our my colleagues who have helped with the organization of this event. So Claire Prasha, Siddhartha Bassi, and Elliot Silverstein. At this time, I'm going to introduce Allan Gregg from Earnscliffe Strategy, and Allan is going to be monitoring the discussion throughout the webinar. And Allan is a well-respected public affairs professional and someone who has been very engaged in Ontario politics over the last several years throughout his entire career. So with that, I'm going to turn to Allan to kick things off, introduce our panelists, and begin the conversation. Allan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and welcome all to this webinar, Polling, Politics, and Predictions, the Ontario election 2022. On behalf of my fellow panelists and all my colleagues at Earnscliffe Strategies, I also want to say that we're delighted to be partnering with the Public Affairs Association of Canada today. It's been a great working relationship, and that we're hoping this is first of many endeavors that we do together. As is typical, I'm joined by a number of my colleagues. Let me introduce them to you around the table. First, Rahul Bedi is the former Deputy Chief of Staff to the Minister of Finance and the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Economic Development, Trade, and some other part of the economy in Queen's Park. He's also works out of our Toronto office. Chris Ball is a longtime NDP activist, former advisor to the late and lamented Jack Layton, as well as Andrea Horvath, the current leader of the Ontario NDP. In his other life, he also served as the Director of Communications and Media Relations at both CBC and Vice Media. Julia Garner is a very active Liberal from the Kitchener-Waterloo region, also served in Queen's Park under Liberal governments, 5 different cabinet ministers in 4 different portfolios. So she has a vast breadth of knowledge of not just politics, but public policy. And unlike those 3 grubby partisans, we're joined by Marianne Carter, who has no political affiliation. She works out of our Ottawa office as a public policy expert in a number of fields, including trade, healthcare, education. She also holds a Master's of Law degree from the University of Ottawa. Our 5th panelist is my colleague, Doug Anderson, who is the co-lead of our public opinion research practice, and that he has been conducting research on a weekly basis throughout the course of this written period. And so I'm going to ask him to show the panel and everyone who's tuned in what our most recent findings are. I mean, literally hot off the press. This is the most current data you're going to see. Before he does that, though, I just want to tell everyone that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You should feel free to put questions to either individual panelists or the panel as a whole. Marianne is going to be monitoring that, and that I will go to her 2 or 3 times over the course of the next hour, and we will get those Q&As. If we don't get to you, We will answer you in writing after the fact. So with that, Doug, take her away.
And of all things, I forgot to unmute myself. Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here. And once again, we have the fourth wave of our weekly study of Ontario voters. Each week we've been doing 1,000 respondents in Ontario and asking not just vote intention, but different types of probing questions each week to gain some additional insight into what's going on. First, I want to walk you through the horse race. Vote intention numbers right now, we're finding that the PC party leads with a healthy 9% margin between themselves and the Liberal Party. At 37%, it's tricky range, I would put it, for getting a majority, but closer to majority range than minority range. As I said, the Liberals are in second at 28% and the NDP at 23% right now. In terms of how that's been tracking, there's been some minor fluctuation over the 4 weeks of tracking we've done, but basically the trend is stability rather than top line shifts. Although regionally, some different stories emerge and suggest that things have been moving more under the surface than what this top line might show. In terms of the regional standings right now, because as we all know, the first past the post system that we're in, the more granular the regional definition, the more valuable the polling result. And what we're showing here, there's some very different races across the province. The PC's lead in GTA, which in our definition is basically the greater Golden Horseshoe area. It excludes Metro Toronto, but it's a self-selection of GTA otherwise. They also lead in the Southwest. But in the East, we now see the Liberals have a lead. I say now because that's different from how things have been tracking. In Metro Toronto, PCs and Liberal are basically tied, but the Liberals maybe have a slight edge still there. And the Liberals have opened up a small lead in Hamilton, Niagara as well. I won't be referring to the North numbers specifically because our sample is like 40 respondents each week, so it tends to be too small. But I wanted to show you a few things about what actually has been fluctuating. In the Southwest, the PCs have had a lead, Metro Toronto. Residents have been less inclined to say that they're voting NDP and over the past few weeks, and more inclined to say Liberal. But really, the battle has consistently been fairly close between Liberal Party and PC Party in Metro Toronto respondents. Green Party has seen some drop off as well, and that's obviously gone to other parties, presumably Liberal, given the direction that line has been going. Southwest is showing that the PC Party is opening up the widest lead they've had. Hamilton Niagara is one of the two regions we're going to talk about as having the greatest fluctuation and is decidedly different from the start of the campaign. The Liberals had never really been leading. I mean, we would call that May 1st study a tie, but now are ahead by 8%, whereas last week we had PC Party ahead by 8%. So there's a lot of volatility in Hamilton Niagara. And similarly, in Eastern Ontario, there have been shifts, although less volatile and sort of a more consistent trend going on here. The most notable is the mirror opposite directions of the blue PC Party support and the red Liberal Party support there. NDP had maybe one anomalous week last week, but otherwise, if you look at the other 4 points of data that we have there, the number for the NDP has stayed kind of stable. Just want to show one other demographic break, which is of the 3 age groups that we regularly analyze, 2 of them have been absolutely flat, but one of them has shown fluctuations. Here we're seeing the 18 to 34 break, fair bit of volatility here. The one trend that has held steady is a decline in NDP vote intent. On the whole, this has benefited Liberal numbers, but it begs the question, Given track record of turnout among 18 to 34, it being lower than among older voters, can this result, which is clearly moving the top line numbers, really be relied on to convert into support at a ballot box? Two other things I want to show you before I turn it over to the panel for discussion. One thing is momentum. So we asked a question, which party do you feel has the momentum right now? It's been gaining momentum. This always has a partisan bias. So there's a tendency to say the party that you're already inclined to vote for is the one having momentum. But really the story becomes in what all the other answers are and what proportion are picking somebody else, whether there's a consensus around any other party. And what we're showing here is conservatives and liberal supporters, both, 56, 60% saying their own party is the one with the greatest momentum. The tendency is lower among NDP voters. In terms of which other party has the momentum right now, opinion is kind of divided. So, you see under the PC supporters, it's evenly split. If they're not saying conservative, it's evenly split between Liberal and NDP and so on. So it's not really that there's a consensus around who does have a momentum, but one takeaway from this slide is that it looks like NDP voters are less likely right now to feel it's their own party. Regionally, the breaks vary somewhat, but the main story is there's divided opinion on this point everywhere. Maybe there's more sense that conservatives have momentum in the areas surrounding Toronto and Southern Ontario, and more sense of liberal momentum in Metro Toronto and Eastern Ontario. Finally, one issue that we probed in a little bit more detail is the issue of affordability. We've shared results on this multiple times over the course of the campaign. It is clearly an issue on the minds of all Ontarians. And let's just talk about just how on the minds of all Ontarians it is. We asked how important the issue is. The issue of affordability, will be in determining your vote. So not just how important an issue is it, but in terms of influencing your vote. And 90% basically are saying it's going to be somewhat important or very important, with the plurality, the majority, in fact, saying very important. That actually doesn't change very much by partisan lines. So every party's supporters basically agree with the near unanimity on the importance of this issue. Likewise, the consensus is pretty consistent across all regional breaks. So this is maybe the most consistent, broad issue of importance to people. And we're also seeing different types of approaches, policy approaches being presented by the different parties and the leaders. And so we wanted to test the level of support for each of four, what we would call contrasting policy approaches. And on this point, we find very little difference of opinion between whether we ask them, well, how strongly would you support or oppose policies to make the cost of housing more affordable, or reducing taxes and providing rebate checks to put cash in people's hands, or investing in things like childcare, transit, or health services, or raising minimum wage. When we have a crisis level like the consensus that we're seeing on an issue, and we see almost no nuance in opinion when it comes to the policy approach taken, our typical interpretation of this is people are saying, we're in crisis, do something, do anything. And the ideas all sound good, and they're not necessarily weighing the downsides or trade-offs between them. But when forced to choose which of those approaches they might like, we get, maybe not a perfect random distribution of response, but certainly very close for three things. About a third will say reduce taxes and provide rebate checks, put cash in people's hands. Almost as many are saying make the cost of housing more affordable. A little bit farther behind at 21% of people choosing investing in things like childcare and so on. And really, minimum wage is the one that finds the lowest proportion, saying this would be the one that I would most want to see occur. Regionally, there's hardly any variance at all in these kinds of responses. But the policy approaches by party support do tell you something about how voters may be aligning. PCs and those who are supporting other there's much more consensus around tax cuts and rebates being the approach that they would prefer. But probably worth noting that half of PC party voters are picking some other approach as being more preferential to that. No other party finds the same degree of consensus on this question of approach to dealing with affordability. And with that, just want to say that these results and many more are available on our website. Will be certainly by the time this webinar is over. So thanks very much. Back to you, Allan.
Thank you, Doug. Great stuff as always, and it will inform our discussion for the next kind of 50 minutes, 40 minutes. But first, we had another big event this week. I mean, we all know that the debates almost uniquely have the potential to really change things up, the direction, the momentum, even the outcomes of elections. So I want to start with a quick roundtable about Monday nights. I mean, was that debate one of those occasions? Did it change anything material in this campaign, Rahul?
Well, thanks, Allan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I think debates often have a lagging impact on elections, and I think we'll still need to see how and if the polling numbers shift over the next couple of days before we truly know the full impact. On initial reaction, I think the winner of the debate was Mike Schreiner in the Green Party. Unfortunately for him, he had the least to lose or gain, so that result is kind of moot. Generally, that's good news for the incumbent Ontario PCs and Doug Ford, and I think bad news for the Ontario Liberals and NDP. Given the polling numbers so far, the onus was really on the opposition leaders to make the case that the ballot box question for voters should be about time for change in at least some form, and I don't think that was accomplished.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to take into account the mood of the electorate right now, and it seems it's really sleepy out there right now. I think folks are kind of happy to see the sun shining. They're happy to be outside, not battling COVID at the same level as we were. And so that kind of factors into the attention factor that people are paying to the debate. And so that limits its potential impact. I've done a bunch of debate prep in my time. And if you look at sort of everybody going into the debate with a strategy, I think what you can say is the government, Doug Ford, their goal was, let's keep this sleepy. Let's keep this like no big shots against me. Let's just make sure that I can get out of this and go on the stump in the next couple of days. So mission accomplished. Mr. Del Duca, I think his strategy was a bit more, let me get off that one good shot against Doug to signal to the folks who might want to coalesce around the anti-Ford vote that I'm their guy. Had a couple of good moments there, I would say. Also sending a signal to the Liberal voters, you can come home again. Probably accomplished that a bit. As far as Ms. Horvath, she took a bit of a different tack, which was being a little bit more relatable. You can trust me, less on the sort of partisan bickering and more on the let's connect as people. But in a sleepy election, we'll wait to see whether that was actually the right strategy when you really need to wake people up to actually think of this as a change election. So still don't know what the impact is, but there were goals met, and we'll see if that actually moves the needle.
Julie, debate make any difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really was that moment where people started to pay attention. I think I've seen driving around in different communities less lawn signs than I've ever seen. Some of that is different bylaws have come into place, but at the same time, it just doesn't seem like people are interested. I agree fully with my colleagues that people want to get outside and they just really want to get back to kind of normal life and don't want to be distracted by other things. That said, there was an opportunity to participate in a really easy and very well managed debate on Monday night, which was nice to see. And people were doing it. I think I agree with Chris's sort of assessments in terms of the missions of the various leaders and kind of where they got with them. But certainly I think for Mr. Del Duca, he was very strong, very confident on that stage. And I think what he wanted to demonstrate is he is that alternative. I think he did that, and you're seeing the kind of the Liberal Party folks really championing the kind of the searches for him, because prior to this, his the knowledge of who the Liberal leader was relatively low.
Marianne, you've been watching political debates for years. Was this one any different? Was there anything here that was earth-shattering?
Well, Allan, I think one of the key points we have to keep in mind is most people don't watch the debate. They watch the clips that are on the next morning. So it's about those big sound bites. And I agree actually with what all of my colleagues are saying. In particular, for those folks who did tune in, I'd have to agree with Rahul about the Green Party leader performing the strongest. In my opinion, the other leaders came off a bit like nervous and shaky, and I found that particularly surprising, as they're all fairly seasoned. Once it got going, there was, more of a dynamic. But I think, the times we're living in right now, where we're easing back into this new normal, or however we're framing it, is way more apparent than if this debate were to take place at the same time last year, where more people were at home, and in some instances, we were going through lockdowns or restrictions and more likely to tune in rather than being outside and enjoying the nice weather.
Yeah, Marianne makes an interesting point. I mean, all the research shows that nothing much changes in the moment of a debate. It's after the fact, what kind of clips are there. And then the one that seems to be most dominant is Green leader Shriner's attacking Ford on nurses. You hear that again and again and again. Rahul, 2 weeks left to go, and we've seen campaigns where tremendous change has happened in the last 2 weeks, but this is the third week in a row that we've had a pretty solid lead on the part of the PCs. And if you're a betting person, you would probably guess that they're going to reform another government. Rather than dealing with the next 2 weeks, I want you to look even beyond that. If they form a new government, what's going to be their first priority? What's going to be their big main initiative out of the gate?
It's a good question. Obviously there's still 2 weeks to go in this election, and we don't want to jinx anything, but it's always a good exercise to be prepared and to hit the ground running. So, within government, and as is the case following elections, of course, there'll be an immediate focus on rejigging cabinet. So that includes rewarding strong performing incumbents and making room for new, fresh talent. As a given, we know that Deputy Premier and Health Minister Christine Elliott will no longer be around the table. And I think this in and of itself will trigger a large set of dominoes within cabinet. Getting that right is important to ensure that the best team is in place to implement and sell the Ford government's second mandate priorities. And it's obviously also an important caucus management exercise. From an issues perspective, and as the data that Doug presented, also reinforces, I think instilling economic confidence in the face of affordability concerns will be a top priority for a re-elected government. For example, the previously legislated 5.7 cent reduction in the gas tax is set to start in July. This, coupled with previous measures to put more money in people's pockets, like we saw with license plate sticker fees, will likely be an initial focus and packaged together for PC MPPs to use in their communities over the summer. Of course, another priority will be the retabling of the budget and related legislation. As we remember, this was tabled before the election but not passed, and it will be important given it serves as the fiscal and policy roadmap for government.
Chris, our own polling shows that the NDP continues to remain competitive, but not much wind in the sails there. Andrea Horvath from the NDP had a pretty good week last week, introducing a 40% reduction in auto insurance premiums. But what do they have to do? What other announcements do they have to make, or what do they have to do to position themselves as the obvious repository for that anti-Ford vote that you talked about?
Totally. And I don't think policy wins this one right now for us, given the fact that, again, things are pretty sleepy out there. I think the Ontario NDP could drop a massive affordability pledge from a helicopter, roaming around the province, and it wouldn't really make a difference right now. The argument that the campaign is making is that the Ontario NDP is the only party that can beat Doug Ford. And while the seat math is there, in theory, The argument really only works if you're upping the urgency of what's really at stake for the electorate, driving that time for a change message, that number that gets people really riled up about, I really need to make a change in government here. So the fact that that number is still pretty flat, that folks aren't really tuning in, huge advantage to the government, but disadvantage to the NDP, who need that antipathy, who need to drive that urgency and need to drive that change narrative for their campaign argument to actually have a bit of zest and then move the polls forward to then get some of those votes to coalesce behind them. So I think you can do a lot of stuff on the stump right now around, you know, affordability pledges. Like, we could talk about regulating gas prices, which would probably be pretty good ahead of May 2 for a long weekend where everybody's going to get gouged by the big oil companies, which is what they would say. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that drives a change in vote, because as we've seen, even the affordability piece, voters are telling us, okay, just fix it. Like, there are many different ways to fix it. You all have different ideas. Okay, fine. And it's more table stakes than an actual driver of vote. So again, it's that drive the change narrative, drive the emotional urgency, get people to remember how they were angry at the government for a little while, and then pivot that to a stronger contrast of how things could be better. How 2018, Doug Ford, people were worried about that guy. What's going to happen in 2022 if he does get a majority government? Those are things that they should be looking at to help drive that urgency a bit harder.
Julia, there's an old campaign maxim: is find an issue and make it your issue. Rather than trying to change people's mind, change the salience of issues to go to your strength. The Liberals brought in a very detailed platform last week, costed $16.7 billion in new spending. What are they likely to focus on in these last 2 weeks? What issues or themes are they going to be hammering away to try to get that momentum that, as we saw, no one has really captured yet?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, policy, I agree with Chris, isn't going to define this, but choices and the way that people make choices really are. So I think what you're going to see Mr. Del Duca doing on the campaign trail is really focusing on issues where people have an emotional connection, trying to get them to feel that and that connection to an issue, and then present the contrast. So you're seeing, in terms of some of the advertising that the party's coming out with right now, a contrast between like spending on 413 versus investing in education. You're going to see contrasts in terms of the way that people are approaching issues. And we even saw that, and you mentioned the Green Party moment where they said, the Green Party leader Mike Schreiner said to the Premier, have you talked to a nurse lately? Where there's a difference in approach. Certainly there's been investments made in healthcare by this government, but there's a different way of approaching that issue if you're coming from a different party. And that's really where they're going to try and distinguish themselves and say that our approach in how we're going to take care of and make decisions on behalf of Ontarians is going to be much more connected with where you emotionally want to see the province going.
The Liberal brand typically and historically has had real strength in the social policy area. So that's what you expect them to be focusing on mostly in the last little bit.
It'll be social, but also the pocketbook issues. So the things that'll continue to drive, and even their plan for economic dignity is much more balanced than it was in 2018, where it's really taking into consideration small businesses and the impact that some of the progressive policies would have on them, and the impact that, you know, if we put in sick days, what is that going to do to some of the businesses that have been most hurt by the pandemic. So I think it'll be a balance of those social issues, but it'll be where people's minds are. I mean, even my 13-year-old daughter came home from school the other day saying that everybody in their class was talking about gas prices. I mean, these are issues that, and I was very surprised. She said even some of the ones that are completely checked out. So, and I don't know where I'm not going to comment on where she is in that spectrum. She's an awesome kid. But she was saying that I mean, these issues are the ones that people are talking around about the dinner table within their classrooms. And so they're going to connect on the issues where people are going to have that emotional connection to, as Chris was saying earlier, make this a bit of a change election. We need change in terms of how issues are being approached in our province.
Marianne, in 2015 federally, in 2018 provincially, we saw a lot of federal-provincial interplay. There's federal parties interplaying with provincial politics and provincial parties interplaying with federal politics. None of that at this particular point in time? Is it, you know, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government in Ottawa is not apparent at all in this campaign? Many believe to the detriment of the Liberal Party and to the advantage of the Conservatives. I mean, do the federal Liberals not really care about their provincial cousins here? What's going on?
It's a good question, Alan, and I think there's a lot of folks wondering that, but maybe I'll try and frame it a bit differently. I think the Doug Ford of 3 years ago is quite different compared to the Doug Ford of today. And what I mean by that is that I think he's actually, and I know there's been commentary on this already, but he's sort of grown into being a politician. You can see that sort of like maturing side. He switched up some of his top advisors at the beginning. He has ultimately worked more collaboratively with the federal government, particularly during COVID. But as many will recall, there was that joint announcement between Justin Trudeau and the Premier on the eve of the announcement before the election about the investment in Southern Ontario, New Windsor, on electric vehicles. And I think both leaders see the importance of working together. As we know, Ontario's makes up a huge demographic of the federal demographic as well. And the likelihood, and I think this is sort of where the Prime Minister is thinking, that the Premier will be re-elected according to the polls is high. And so that creating that path forward to continue to work collaboratively together on a variety of issues that matter to the federal government is a strategic one. And so I think it's more about the issues around affordability and how they intersect between the federal and provincial spheres.
I want to stay with you, Marianne, because you've been looking at the Q&A box there. Are there any questions that have been posed that you want to raise?
Yeah, we have a couple questions. Maybe we'll just stay on this for a second and around the federal dynamics about, are the attitudes toward Justin Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre impacting provincial voter intention in any way?
Interesting. Rahul, you want to take that for federal figures impacting provincial vote recall?
Sure. I think, to the point Marianne made, I think that, particularly between this federal government, these federal Liberals, Trudeau voters, I think there has been a bit of a calculation that many of the people who vote for the Trudeau Liberals are the same blocks of voters, particularly in the GTA, that vote for the Ford Ontario PCs. And so I think there is a bit of a nexus point there. In terms of the federal leadership, it's a good question. I would say at this point, there haven't been a lot of intersections. There's been the federal leadership debate and some issues around that's been running in parallel. But at this point in time, in terms of an externality that's impacting either politically or from a policy perspective, this provincial election, I don't think we're seeing a lot of evidence of that yet.
Julie, you want to jump in on this one?
Sure. I'd just like to say that I'm just not seeing it. I thought that there would be a little bit of a brand, more of a brand impact. I mean, certainly the provincial Liberals did a rebranding exercise, kind of putting themselves out there a little bit differently, but it doesn't seem to be having a material impact. It's more so the legacy, and certainly we saw that come up a number of times in the debate. Is this the 2018 election, or are we fighting the 2022 election? And Mr. Del Duca really trying to put that in the rearview mirror, as Andrea Horvath would like to say, in the debate. So that's really the kind of the impact in terms of kind of other external factors I think that we're seeing, but even that I think is quickly moving into the background.
Just a twist on that, Chris, because in many ways the most surprising thing in the data Doug presented is how much better the provincial Conservatives do than the federal Conservatives in urban areas, especially Toronto. Our polling, they're only 3 points behind the Liberals right now. We've talked many, many times about how important it is to the NDP strategy to capitalize on Liberal switchers. Are you worried about your flank by Conservatives in the city of Toronto?
So I'm gonna start with a bit of a weasel response in that it depends on how we define Toronto. There's Toronto, the Scarborough, there's Mississauga, and then there's the 905 around it. So the numbers right now, to me, if we're looking at it from the bigger Toronto piece, you're including Mississauga, you're including Scarborough, you're including some of those outside of the old city. And I think we're seeing some of Ford's support kind of over-indexing in those places where he's already quite popular. From a seat perspective, I think that poses a bit of a challenge for us in Scarborough. There was possibly some winnable seats up there and a couple of MPPs up there, so it makes that orange-blue fight a little bit more pointed, and we'll kind of change where some resources go in the coming days to make sure that those seats are shored up. As it gets to the old city in the 416 and the waterfront, like if Doug Ford is picking up and the PCs are picking up more support there, it shrinks the available pool of vote, obviously, for everybody, both Liberals and Democrats, because the Ford brand is like a post-partisan brand in a lot of ways. Like they bring in New Democrats, they bring in Liberals, they bring in everybody. And so the challenge really more for in the old city is the red-orange fight around the waterfront, and making sure that the incumbents are solid along the waterfront seats that we have for the ONDP, versus worrying a ton about the Ford vote. Like I don't foresee, unless we're in for a massive surprise on election day, that like somewhere like Davenport will all of a sudden have a PC and PP. But it does possibly shrink that available pool of vote for anybody who's looking to make a change there.
Well, I want to bring Rahul in on that, because is there any expectation within the Conservative camp that they could have a breakthrough in Toronto proper? And as Chris suggested, maybe not in the downtown core, but certainly the Scarboroughs, the balance of the Etobicoke seats that are there and available if you're 35% of the popular vote.
Yeah, as Chris indicated, I don't think the PC campaign is planning victory parades in Toronto Centre or University Rosedale at the moment, but I think the polling suggests some interesting insights about PC support in the 416, and to me, it's not something that's really all that surprising. Doug Ford and the party that he's built, in my view, has the strongest roots in Toronto of any PC leader in generations. His family has strong roots in its municipal politics, and the heart of the Ford Nation movement is in Etobicoke. On top of that, you've seen a PC government put real political and financial capital in key legacy projects, if call it the 416 area, such as the revitalization of Ontario Place and large-scale transit projects such as the Ontario line. So I think the Ontario PCs will look to capitalize on those advantages. And of course, I think that could be further aided by NDP Liberal vote splits that help them maintain some incumbent seats and potentially gain more in key areas, specifically Scarborough and Etobicoke.
Julie, the Liberals haven't been without their controversies either. And it's, 3 candidates they've basically disqualified. Very surprising, given that Liberal leader Del Duca's claim that he didn't run was that he could spend more time recruiting candidates, the emphasis they put on in their talking points in the early days about their team. How does that happen? And does that, the fact that it has happened, hurt the Liberals' credibility with progressive voters?
Thanks for the question. I mean, how does it happen? We're in the information age where information is so much more accessible. I think about running a campaign in the 80s versus today in terms of what you can find out about what people did and said back in high school. So, I mean, they had a Herculean task in terms of being able to find candidates, because they were really starting from a limited number with their results in the 2018 election. Certainly other parties have done it too, but the candidate vetting process is intense. What we've seen is some candidates being disqualified in some of the ridings that weren't as high profile. So the priority ones received a lot of attention, and certainly there was the effort across the board was for I think a very good process that would vet candidates and make sure that individuals were right, but certainly nothing's perfect, and obviously there's a huge machine, a huge blue machine that is capable of unearthing a lot of things right now, that is very well resourced and is doing that job. And certainly that's going to come up. I think it's better to have these things come up during the election so that the individuals that are putting check marks next to those names know who it is that they are voting for. And I think what's important is that swift action is taken. I think swift, but it also has to be well considered. There's been a couple instances, there was at least one instance where things were very swift. And I think that that's really important in terms of showing decisive leadership, but it's not without its perils as well. But I would say that in terms of damage that it's having on the Liberal Party, I don't think it really is impacting. I think that this election really isn't about the strength of team, although I do think team is very, very important when evaluating vote. I think it is about kind of what they're standing for. It'll be about the choices and how people relate to the choices that each of the leaders are putting forward. And it's going to be about leadership. And that's why we're seeing, Doug Ford so prominently put in the window in this campaign in terms of Doug will get it done. It's really about that leader's brand. Who do you trust? Who do you relate with? And each of the leaders is really trying to be relatable. And I although these things are kind of water cooler discussion, I think it's how it's handled that is really going to would be a peril. And I think that the Liberals, by and large, have handled it well.
Marianne, one thing that we haven't talked much about, or hasn't been talked much about in the course of this campaign, is the stunning number of incumbents who are not running this time. I mean, 1/4 of all the seats in Ontario are vacated right now, running without an incumbent. What do you make of that as a trend? And secondly, I guess the question is, does that have the potential to change the outcome in this election in ways that maybe our province-wide polling that doesn't really pick up on what's happening at the grassroots riding level would be detecting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I note for Doug to add that in the field. But I mean, there's not a lot of data on this. There's general data on why people choose to not run again. If I had to venture a guess, over the last 2 years and like working as a politician in this unprecedented time during COVID, well, we were working remotely. I think many of our elected officials in Ontario have worked harder than they've ever have in the last couple of years. Some are not running again for more complicated reasons, and there's a variety of them. I think what Rahul pointed out earlier about Christine Elliott not running again. I mean, she's been a veteran politician. She's been in this sphere for a long time, ran a leadership race. I think typically the electorate votes on the leader more so than their local candidate, but with a lot of new faces and the volatility around the polling data, I mean, it's still anyone's race right now, and it could inadvertently impact, I think, some key ridings. I think that's more likely what we're able to see rather than a huge sweep by one particular party across the province. I think we should be looking at some swing ridings in particular, and those hot seats will be critical.
Julie, you wanted to jump in on this?
Yeah, I do. And it's more of a kind of a values team. And I've been talking to a number of folks that aren't putting their names on the ballot again this year, municipally and provincially. And one of the things that constantly comes up, and it was largely through the pandemic, but also, beyond, is the toxicity of politics and how mean people are or have been getting, especially over social media, and how difficult in this strain that's taken on them personally. And so just, I think, a bit of a sad state of politics. The individuals that put their names on the ballot in this election, I think almost 100% would say that they're trying to make things better. Whether they have your viewpoint on what better is might be different, but I think they are, and I think we as Ontarians aren't giving them enough credit for this point, and it's making it really difficult to keep people wanting to continue to serve.
Yeah, it's true. Very sad. Rose, I want to shift gears a little bit here. Chris referred to Doug Ford as almost having a post-partisan brand. The Progressive Conservative Party has been endorsed now by 6 major labor unions. I have, in the 45 years I've been watching politics, never seen anything like that happen before. What does that mean generally and specifically for the labor vote?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't think this is an accident, and it didn't happen overnight. Significant and well-deserved kudos has gone to Minister McNaughton, who prioritized these relationships when he took over the labor training and skills development portfolio a few years ago. Sometimes it was just as simple as establishing good lines of two-way communication that weren't there before. But also, he and the whole of government took a concerted effort to prioritize skilled trades throughout all segments of the education system, launched a multi-$100 million skilled trade strategy, and tactfully replaced a controversial College of Trades with the new Skilled Trades Ontario agency. And I think all of those efforts are part of what's bearing fruit. And of course, and I think perhaps most importantly, Ford and the Ontario PCs have focused on building housing, transit, highways, new manufacturing capacity that's core to both, again, their political brand, but also the nuts and bolts of their policy agenda. And I think that's ultimately key to ensuring plentiful, good paying jobs for these union members. I think if this trust and policy direction remains, I think we could be seeing a structural change in voting coalitions.
Well, then we've got to bring in Chris. I mean, same question to you. What do these labor endorsements for the PCs mean for the labor vote and specifically for the NDP vote?
So let's zoom out for a second and let's bust a bit of this narrative that, union household always equals NDP voter always and forever, because we can equally ask my Liberal colleagues what OSSTF now endorsing NDP this campaign, but also in 2018, or ETFO in 2018 endorsing the NDP, what that meant for their vote, because those are two unions who have traditionally been quite close to Liberal Party of Ontario, and then they moved into the NDP camp. So while it's a bit of a PR narrative, these things do shift and don't always fall into this kind of like easy dichotomy of union always equals NDP. And in the case of this campaign around the trades, I think Rahul has a bit of it right there around, the union leaders made a decision that they're seeing this government build roads and houses and all these things that their members actually build. And so they decided to make that decision to say, hey, these are our guys. But in the same token, there were in 2018, for example, a union like Leuna, some of their locals equally endorsed New Democrat candidates as much as they endorsed PC candidates, right? So unions aren't monocultures, and the working class vote isn't always driven by the leaders of their unions, and those leaders aren't always driving them to the polls, right? So the folks on the picket line at Queen's Park and helping get legislation passed aren't necessarily the same as the rank and file who have these jobs not out of some allegiance to like social democracy or party, but an allegiance to like a good paycheck or a preferred career path. And so a lot of more of the like on the ground concerns, like their commute, like job security, all those other things sort of sometimes take precedence. So one other little point I'll make just specific to the NDP is that I talked about this in a previous webinar, is that it doesn't mean that we don't have some work to do, because there was this old Venn diagram that we used to be able to rely upon a bit, which was sort of the broadsheet newspaper, like Toronto Sun reader, union member, and right in the middle there would be NDP voter. So more rank and file than kind of intellectual and activist. And that's been eroding for a few years. And so as we look to a path forward, maybe we need to look a bit at like reaching back into those folks' lives so they feel seen, the working class as well as the leadership and activist class, and so making sure they all feel at home in our party.
Well,
so
you've seen this in the United States with the Democrats. It's, a real problem with blue collar workers. And I think, Rahul, all of these 6 unions are all private sector unions, aren't they?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Marianne, any questions from the people who've tuned in?
Yes. I want to touch on one that I found really interesting, that focuses on, and maybe we can throw this to Chris, and maybe we could tie a couple together, Allan, if that's okay. So the first one is, what is driving the numbers in Hamilton, Niagara? The NDP carry a majority of those seats, with the Tories being quite competitive, particularly in Niagara. What has driven the shift?
For me, so those are like, we look at those as blue, orange, red fights, right? So it's more like brown because it's all three colors kind of fighting with each other. So while we do hold a majority of those seats, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were easily always won. There is an incumbency factor there that has definitely helped us in a lot of those seats, but that's kind of the confluence, right? Of that, like, you've got the auto plants, you've got high working class vote, you have with places like Hamilton also an influx of new people from, you know, godless Toronto coming in and gentrifying up the place. And so there's some demographic shifts that are happening in some of those regions that all parties, I think, need to be mindful of. But those are always like really interesting three-way fights.
You have a
Sorry, go ahead,
supplementary
Allan.
question there, Marianne? Did you have a supplementary question?
Yeah, and just to build on that. So, and this is more general, but just in terms of in 2014 and 2018, we saw significant left/liberal vote coalesce around the first win, and then Horwath. But argument could also be made that the same thing happened in Ontario in federal elections. 2011 vote went to Layton, then 2015, 2019, and 2021 to Trudeau. Is there any evidence of growing movement to either Del Duca or Horwath about the anti-conservative coalescing around one of them?
You wanted to go for that, Julie?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there certainly is. I mean, as Chris said, there's this, it's a three-way fight. So in terms of the progressive vote in those areas, I think you're going to see people want to place their vote where it's going to have the most impact. And if it is an anti-vote, they're going to place it with where they think has the most momentum and the leaders that they think have really showed up for them in the election. So I think it could be a combination of maybe some gravitation to some of the messages that that the various campaigns are putting out and what isn't appealing to them, as well as who's showing momentum. And so I think that's going to be kind of the story over the next couple of days. I mean, we're seeing it obviously with the Ford campaign, we're seeing it with the Del Duca campaign, and we're seeing Ms. Horwath's kind of campaign flatline a little bit.
We've only got about 5 more minutes left, and I want to bring Alex back in here to tie things up. So I'm going to ask the last question, and just very generally around the clock. I mean, 2 weeks to go. What is the single most important thing you're going to be watching for, Rahul?
I'll be continuing to look for, you know, is this a time for change? And that sentiment, at the end of the day, you know, there's all these issues we've talked about. I think they're all knitted together to some degree. Is this a change election or not? And if that sentiment starts to track up, that'll be the key thing that I'll be watching for.
Because in our polling 2 weeks ago, I mean, we showed, in fact, that time for a change sentiment is not that great at all. I mean, the number who were saying their vote was driven by an antipathy to someone else as opposed to support was relatively small compared to like the 2015 federal election, for example, or the 2018 provincial election. Marianne, what are you looking for these last 2 weeks?
Similarly, I feel it's like people vote governments out, not in. And it is the ballot question is, how well did Doug Ford serve us in this last term? And it will all be framed around affordability.
Julie, you talked to us earlier as a group about advertising. Last 2 weeks campaign, always intensive advertising. You load up your media buy you know, towards the end, because we know, I mean, we've done polls where as many as 13% of the electorate say they're deciding on election day how they're going to vote. What are you looking for in these last 2 weeks?
I'm looking for, I mean, the campaigns are gonna continue to go a little bit negative and try and kind of get people back on that emotional roller coaster. As long as the Ford campaign doesn't make any mistakes, the plausibility of kind of that emotional response coming back to the surface and really growing hot again is difficult. But we've seen people go on huge emotional roller coasters over the last 2 years, especially with COVID, and with their feelings around Premier Ford. So I think I'll be watching to see, first of all, how kind of people are emotionally feeling, especially going into this weekend where filling up half my tank is now the same cost as it used to be to fill up the whole. And also I'll be watching to see how the NDP and Liberal momentum track, because of course the split vote really does kind of ensure a very strong blue victory. So I'll be watching for those two things.
Last word to you, Chris.
Oof. Yeah, I think all my colleagues kind of all have it right there, right? So upping the urgency of the campaign, having clear, crisp messages, clear contrast against Doug Ford, and seeing who's winning that fight to kind of coalesce the anti-Ford vote. Now, we don't have a lot of time though, right? Like the May 2-4 is happening. Everybody's up to their cottage. They're going to get shocked by $2, $8,000 gas prices. And I'm really interested to see if there's an echo in that last week of the campaign when people are coming back and they've filled up their tank twice. And now they're looking for some relief over the last like 6 days of the campaign where people might actually start paying attention. So yeah, I think it's a combination of what everybody, my smart colleagues have all said, like, let's get the urgency up there. Let's drive the change message and let's see what gas prices do. That could be an interesting factor.
Great conversation. Alex, why don't we go to you to tie things up for us?
Thank you so much, Allan. And I think that was a fantastic discussion. I think the polling that was presented by Doug at the start, I think really crystallized where things are at, during this election right now. And I think campaigns do matter. And I think the next couple of weeks will be interesting to see how everything's going to unfold. I do want to state a few thank yous. First to the entire team at Earnscliffe Strategies, all our panelists, and to you, Allan, for not only being a tremendous partner, but also providing the insights today. I think it was a well-flowing conversation that I think our members and non-members really will value. And so to let everyone know, we have recorded this session. We will be circulating the recording following the conclusion of this event. So I just want to say thank you to everyone at Earnscliffe. Secondly, I want to thank all our attendees today who attended this event. All your engagement and participation really helps, bring our events to life, but also allows for good conversation and good dialogue on a wide variety of different public policy issues. Thirdly, if for those who are not members of the Public Affairs Association of Canada, we are always looking for new members, and without the support of our members, we are not an association. So being a member of PAAC allows you to participate on a committee, participate in the AGM, participate in our member benefits, including discounts to Polytrack, Queen's Park today, to name a couple of examples of our member benefits. So if you are interested in becoming a member of the association, I encourage you to visit our website, publicaffairs.ca, as well as to contact our membership chair, Connor Hamill, who can provide you additional details about membership. Fourth, we do have a series of events that we are going to be planning in June and throughout the fall. We will be doing a post-election event, and details will be forthcoming for the week of June 6th. We are planning a Welcome Back Queen's Park social in September, to continue our resumption of in-person events. The first in-person event will actually be in June for our post-election event. We have our annual conference coming up in October, a municipal election coming up in October as well. And then we will be wrapping up the year with our holiday social. So we will be having a busy event season. If you do have any suggestions in terms of topics that we should cover for events or suggested panelists, please get in touch with our events chair, Sadaf Abbasi, who has done a great job in terms of keeping us accountable for our events on an ongoing basis. Lastly, if you do have any feedback on the association or anything else we could do in terms of our initiatives, programming, activities, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me. at alex@canadianbeverage.ca. That is my email address, and I'd be happy to chat with anyone at a given time. So on behalf of all of us, the Public Affairs Association of Canada's Ontario chapter and Earnscliffe Strategies, thank you again for attending today, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Have a great day.
Thank you all.